The evening sun slowly sank below the horizon, casting golden-orange hues over the streets of London. The city was filled with people rushing home or seeking entertainment. In the center of the city, on one of the busiest shopping streets, a group of men in Royal Guard uniforms stood by a high-end store window, chatting among themselves. Their black uniforms, with bold red accents, drew the attention of passers-by, and their posture was straight, their faces calm and focused. But for not every passerby was their presence pleasant. Jeanette, a middle-aged woman holding an expensive smartphone, was walking quickly toward a nearby cafe. She moved fast, her mind elsewhere, until her gaze accidentally fell upon the group of men. Suddenly, her steps slowed, and a rush of thoughts invaded her mind, preventing her from moving forward. "What are they doing here?" she thought. These men, tall and strong, in dark uniforms with stern expressions on their faces, they couldn't be ordinary civilians. Her pace faltered as unease crept up inside her. What if they were here for some ill intent? Her heart raced as images of danger flashed before her eyes, though nothing seemed to be amiss. But one detail caught her attention: these men were black. That only deepened her unease. Without realizing it, her mind began to race, conjuring up fears and assumptions she couldn't quite shake. She didn't consciously acknowledge it, but her discomfort grew. Perhaps it was an instinctual reaction, but the thoughts she had been trying to suppress took over. These men could be criminals. She couldn't shake the feeling of threat, though there was no logical reason for it. She imagined them as thieves, or worse, as potential troublemakers. It was irrational, but the fear was there, and it grew stronger the longer she stared. Jeanette's hands began to shake, and her heart thudded in her chest. She couldn't just stand there. The only solution in her mind was clear: she had to do something. Quickly, she pulled out her phone and dialed the police. The bustling sounds of the street seemed to fade as the urgency of the situation consumed her. She tried to steady her breath, but panic was evident in her voice as she spoke. "Hello, police? I've just seen a group of suspicious men. They're in military uniforms, but they're acting strange. I'm not sure what they're up to, but they shouldn't be here," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, though she couldn't mask the fear creeping into her tone. Her voice wasn't driven by concern for safety, it was driven by fear, by the stereotypes she had unconsciously clung to. In her mind, these men were no longer people, they were a potential threat. They were black, and in her mind, that was enough to trigger alarm. As she spoke to the dispatcher, she didn't even realize how her words might be painting a picture of danger, when in reality, these men were simply standing around, minding their own business. They were soldiers, not criminals. They were defenders of the crown, not threats. But Jeanette couldn't see it. Her thoughts were clouded by preconceived notions, and she felt that something wasn't right, even though no one had given her any reason to believe that. The police, hearing the distress in her voice, responded quickly, dispatching several patrol units to the scene. Jeanette continued to stand frozen, her heart racing as she awaited their arrival, completely unaware of the potential consequences of her actions. In her mind, the situation seemed dire, and she was convinced that she had made the right decision, even though she had no evidence to justify her assumptions. As the police cars pulled up, a sense of tension filled the air. The men standing by the store window, however, remained unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. They continued to chat calmly, exchanging news and enjoying the late afternoon. To them, there was no danger, no threat. They were simply doing their duty as royal guards. They had no reason to think anything was amiss. But all that was about to change. The police, arriving on the scene, began to assess the situation, unsure of what they were walking into. The atmosphere was thick with unease, though the royal guards remained calm. They had seen tension before, but nothing like this, not because of their duty, but because of the misunderstanding that was about to unfold. Jeanette's phone call had set off a chain of events that none of them had expected. The officers, though professional, were unsure of how to handle the situation. They saw the group of men standing in the street, their demeanor unwavering, and they couldn't quite understand why they had been called in. They knew nothing of the men's true identities or their role in the royal guard. The tension in the air grew thicker as Jeanette, unaware of the complexity of what was unfolding, stood waiting for the arrival of more officers. But for Jeanette, the story was only beginning. Her actions, fueled by fear and stereotype, were about to collide with reality. It was a reality that none of them were prepared for. The blaring sirens grew louder as the police cars neared the street, and with each passing second, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Jeanette, still standing on the sidewalk, watched as the officers pulled up, their blue lights casting eerie flashes over the street. She felt a wave of both relief and anxiety. Her heart raced as the officers stepped out of their vehicles, scanning the scene. The royal guards, unaware of the approaching storm, still stood by the store window, composed and still. Their rigid posture seemed almost out of place amidst the rising tension. They had no idea that a simple evening on duty was about to turn into something dangerous. As the first officer approached, his gaze swept over the group of men, his suspicion evident. The uniforms, the serious expressions, and their military discipline made the officer hesitate for a moment. His hand instinctively moved toward his radio, ready to call for backup if things escalated. Jeanette, still watching from the curb, felt the anxiety building inside her. Was this the moment she had been anticipating? Was she right to feel afraid, or had she made a terrible mistake? The uncertainty gnawed at her, making her heart pound even faster. She could see the officers engaging in a tense conversation with the guards, and the quiet grew more oppressive with every passing second. The officer, finally speaking, ordered, "You, over there. What are you doing here?" "We've received reports of suspicious activity." The guards, though still calm, exchanged quick glances. Their faces remained unreadable, but their posture tightened slightly. They were trained to stay composed, but the shift in the air was palpable. They had been in tense situations before, but this felt different. The suspicion was sharper, more personal. "State your business," the officer demanded again, his tone rising. One of the guards shifted, his gaze fixed on the officer. His expression was unyielding, but he didn't respond. The silence that followed felt like it would stretch on forever. The officer, clearly unnerved, stepped back and glanced at his partner, a younger officer standing a few feet away, watching with growing confusion. "We need backup," the senior officer muttered under his breath, his hand hovering over his radio. Jeanette's pulse quickened. The police officers seemed agitated, and she couldn't help but wonder if they were starting to doubt her story. Was she wrong to have called them? Was she imagining danger where there was none? A wave of doubt washed over her, but she couldn't turn back now. As the police continued questioning the guards, a new figure appeared, a tall, broad senior officer. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic. He took in the scene with a calm but authoritative gaze, sizing up the situation in a matter of seconds. Without saying a word, he walked toward the guards. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The guards stiffened but didn't answer. The tension was so thick it seemed to hang in the air, suffocating everyone present. Jeanette's heart was racing as the silence between the officers and the guards grew longer. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, and her earlier doubts were quickly being replaced with a sense of dread. The senior officer looked the guards over carefully. Their immaculate uniforms and straight backs told him everything he needed to know, but he needed confirmation. "Identify yourselves," he demanded. Finally, one of the guards spoke. His voice was calm and steady, though his words held a weight of authority. "We are members of the British Royal Guard, serving the Crown. We're on official duty." The words hit Jeanette like a slap. She felt the color drain from her face. She had called the police on Royal Guards, members of the most elite force in the country, based on nothing but her own unfounded fears. Her stomach churned with embarrassment and shame. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The officers exchanged confused glances, processing the new information. The senior officer stood silent, his expression hardening as he realized the gravity of the situation. These weren't just any men, they were elite protectors of the monarchy, sworn to serve the crown. Jeanette felt her breath catch in her throat. The realization hit her hard. She had made a terrible mistake. She had allowed her prejudices and fears to cloud her judgment, and now the consequences were unfolding before her eyes. The silence between the officers and the royal guards was deafening. Jeanette's mind raced. She had triggered this situation. She had caused this unnecessary confrontation. The guards, calm and composed, stood there with dignity, but she knew they had to be just as aware of the tension as she was. The senior officer turned to his partner, his face tight with frustration. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered, before looking back at the guards. "Apologies for the disturbance, gentlemen." The younger officer seemed hesitant, still processing the confusion. "We didn't know, we thought." "Enough," the senior officer snapped, his gaze cutting through the air. "You'll handle the paperwork later. Now go." The younger officer nodded quickly, retreating. The senior officer remained for a moment, staring at the group of guards with a sense of both respect and frustration. Finally, he turned back to Jeanette, his eyes cold. "You may want to reconsider your assumptions next time," he said, his voice hard with a mixture of disbelief and judgment. Jeanette nodded, her face burning with shame. She had no words to defend herself. Her mind was racing with regret, but it was too late for apologies. The damage was done. As the officers left, the guards returned to their positions, their professionalism undisturbed. But for Jeanette, the weight of her mistake would linger. She had let her fears take control, and in doing so, had tarnished her own sense of understanding. The situation had escalated far beyond what she had imagined, and now the truth was clear. The royal guards had been calm, dignified, and resolute. But Jeanette had learned a hard lesson, one that would stay with her forever. The silence after the police's departure felt suffocating. Jeanette stood frozen on the sidewalk, her eyes fixed on the royal guards who had returned to their post as though nothing had happened. They remained composed, their military discipline unbroken by the entire ordeal. But to Jeanette, the world had shifted. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a deep sense of shame crept over her. How had she misjudged them so completely? She had allowed her own fears to dictate her actions, to call the police on men who were not only innocent but highly respected. The weight of her mistake was suffocating. As she turned to walk away, trying to distance herself from the memory of the scene, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. A chill ran down her spine. She turned and saw the senior officer, the one who had been in charge of the situation. His footsteps were purposeful, and his eyes were locked on her as he neared. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, his voice calm but firm. Jeanette's stomach dropped. She had no idea what he wanted, but she already knew she wouldn't like it. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to face him. "You may want to be more careful next time," the officer said, his words deliberate. "You don't know who you're dealing with. People's lives aren't for you to judge based on assumptions." Jeanette felt her face burn with humiliation. She opened her mouth to apologize, but the officer cut her off. "Don't let fear guide your decisions. You've made a mistake tonight, but you don't have to keep making the same one," he said, his voice sharp, but not unkind. The weight of his words hit her like a slap. He wasn't just reprimanding her, he was trying to teach her something. She had acted out of fear, out of a conditioned belief, and now she had to face the consequences. Without another word, the officer turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the growing darkness. Jeanette stood there, numb, as the tension in her chest only deepened. The reality of her actions was sinking in. This wasn't just a small mistake. She had nearly destroyed the lives of innocent people, simply because she had been afraid. As she made her way back to her apartment, the weight of her thoughts seemed to drag her down. She couldn't shake the image of the guards, their stoicism, their dignity in the face of unjust treatment. How had they managed to stay so calm while everything around them had fallen apart? She felt a deep respect for them, but it was tainted by the guilt she carried. The next day, the fallout began. News of the incident spread quickly, and Jeanette saw her face on social media. The footage of her phone call to the police had been shared widely, with people questioning her motives. The video was grainy, but the words were clear. Suspicious men acting strangely. The comments were relentless. Some defended her, claiming that she had just been doing what she thought was right. Others, however, accused her of racial profiling, pointing out the underlying assumptions she had made simply because of their appearance. Jeanette couldn't escape the growing backlash. It wasn't just about the guards anymore. It was about the broader issue of prejudice, the assumptions people made based on skin color, uniform, or stature. She had learned the hard way that these biases ran deep, and now she was being forced to confront her own. But it wasn't just the public that was making her feel the weight of her actions. Jeanette couldn't stop thinking about the royal guards. She had seen their faces, stoic, calm, composed. They hadn't raised their voices, hadn't fought back. They had endured the humiliation without so much as a flinch. It was a humbling thing to witness, and it made her own actions seem even more pitiful. Jeanette knew she had to make it right. She needed to apologize to the guards, to show them that she recognized her mistake, that she understood now what she had done. But how? She had no idea how to find them, no idea where to even begin. And would an apology be enough? Would it undo the damage? As the day passed, the debate over racial profiling intensified. The media had picked up the story, and it had become more than just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger conversation about prejudice, assumptions, and the dangers of acting without understanding. People from all walks of life were speaking out, discussing how easy it was to fall into the trap of stereotyping others based on appearance or background. Jeanette's mistake had become a case study in how fear and prejudice could cloud one's judgment. But still, the royal guards remained a silent presence in her mind. They had faced something far more significant than a minor misunderstanding. They had been wrongly accused, treated with suspicion, and yet they had stayed silent, dignified. Jeanette admired their strength, but it was mixed with guilt. She had been the one who put them in that position. She had been the one who had taken the first step down that path. The following evening, Jeanette found herself back at the same street, standing at the same corner. The city was quieter now, the usual rush of people having dissipated. It was here, in this quiet moment, that Jeanette realized the true impact of her mistake. It wasn't just a small error in judgment. It was a reminder of how deep the biases ran, how easy it was to fall into the trap of fear, and how difficult it was to undo the harm caused by that fear. But as she stood there, lost in thought, she heard footsteps again. This time, she didn't need to turn to know it was the royal guards. She could sense their presence even before they came into view. The feeling in the air shifted, and she braced herself. They were walking slowly, as if they had known she would be there, and as they passed by, one of them looked at her. Their eyes met, and Jeanette felt a surge of emotion, regret, shame, but also a deep sense of respect. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Their quiet dignity spoke louder than any words ever could. Jeanette stood still, watching them disappear into the night, knowing that she would never forget this lesson. The consequences of her fear had rippled outward, but perhaps, just perhaps, it would lead to a change, both in her and in the world around her. She could only hope. Jeanette couldn't escape the consequences of that fateful night. The incident with the royal guards had become a media storm. People debated whether her actions were justified or if she had been guilty of racial profiling. Her face appeared in news reports, social media posts, and heated discussions everywhere. She felt the weight of her mistake with every glance and whispered conversation. What had seemed like a simple misunderstanding had spiraled into something much larger. Days after the incident, as Jeanette sat in her apartment, exhausted and racked with guilt, there was a knock on her door. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood up to answer. To her surprise, when she opened the door, it was one of the royal guards, the one who had spoken to her that night. He stood there, his uniform sharp, his face unreadable. "Miss Jeanette," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." She stepped aside, letting him in. The contrast between his imposing presence and her small apartment was striking. He closed the door behind him, the tension in the air thickening. "I'm not here for your apology," the guard began, his tone measured. "What you did was wrong, but that's not why I'm here." Jeanette's heart raced. What did he want from her now? "You need to understand something," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "What you did wasn't just about us. It goes far deeper. It's about fear. And it's about the assumptions that lead us to make mistakes. You didn't just call the police on us. You called them on everything we represent." Jeanette swallowed hard. She didn't know how to respond. The weight of his words sank in. "We wear these uniforms because we've earned the trust of the monarchy and the public," he went on. "We stand for honor and respect. When you called the police, you didn't just question us. You questioned everything we stand for." Jeanette opened her mouth, but no words came out. The shame of the situation hit her like a wave. She had allowed her fear to dictate her actions, and now she was facing the consequences. "You made us out to be a threat," the guard continued. "And the real danger is that when people like you make that judgment, it feeds a cycle of fear and distrust. That's something that hurts everyone." Jeanette's mind raced. She had never seen it that way. She had acted out of fear and misunderstanding, but now she realized how much deeper it went. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was part of a larger problem, a problem that affected more people than she had ever imagined. "I didn't know," Jeanette whispered, her voice shaky. "I didn't understand. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The guard looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. "Fear does that. It makes us see things that aren't there. And sometimes, the damage is permanent." Jeanette's stomach churned. She had been wrong. And now, she was paying the price. But it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about what her actions had represented. What they said about how society viewed people who didn't fit into the familiar mold. I don't know how to fix this, Jeanette said, her voice barely a whisper. I never meant for any of this to happen. The guard stepped closer. You can't undo everything, Jeanette. But you can learn. You can grow. And most importantly, you can teach others what you've learned. If you don't, your mistake will continue to affect people in ways you can't even begin to imagine. The weight of his words hung in the air. Jeanette felt herself crumble under the realization of what she had done. It wasn't just about apologizing anymore. It was about confronting the truth, both about her own biases and about the larger system she was a part of. Remember this, the guard said, turning toward the door. We all make mistakes. But what matters is how we move forward. With those words, he left. The door closed quietly behind him, but the silence in the apartment was deafening. Jeanette stood alone, her mind spinning. There was no easy way to fix what she had done, but she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much bigger journey, one that would require her to confront herself and, perhaps, even the society around her. The world hadn't stopped turning, but Jeanette had changed. And for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope, not for immediate redemption, but for the possibility of real change. Jeanette had always believed she was a good person. She believed she stood for fairness, that she treated people with respect, and that, deep down, everyone had the same intentions. But now, every time she passed a mirror, she felt the weight of the woman staring back at her. A woman who had once felt above reproach. A woman who had learned, far too late, that the world doesn't function on good intentions alone. The days following the Royal Guard's visit were the hardest she had ever faced. The stories about the incident continued to dominate the news, with people attacking her from all sides. But it wasn't just the public that made her uncomfortable. It was the whispers she heard in her own life. Friends, co-workers, and even strangers seemed to avoid her, as if she were contagious. Jeanette felt like a pariah, but more than that, she felt the weight of her ignorance pressing down on her every single day. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, there was another knock on her door. Her heart raced. She hadn't expected anyone. Certainly not after the way things had gone before. When she opened it, the Royal Guard from the night of the incident stood before her once again. This time, there was no cold formality in his eyes. They were tired eyes, eyes that had seen far more than they should have had to. Jeanette, he said, his voice softer than before, but still carrying the weight of everything they had discussed. It's not over. Jeanette swallowed, her stomach sinking. I know. But what can I do? I already apologized. I've tried, but nothing changes. People don't see me the same way. The guard stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His presence was commanding, but there was something human about the weariness in his posture. As he closed the door behind him, he looked her straight in the eyes. The problem isn't just with them, he said, nodding toward the world outside. It's with all of us. We live in a world built on assumptions. And that's the hardest thing to change, our own minds. The real question isn't how others see you, Jeanette. It's how you see yourself now. Do you see the woman who called the police that night? Or do you see someone who's ready to do the work to make things right? Jeanette felt her chest tighten. His words stung, but they were the truth. It was so easy to focus on the external, the judgment, the whispers, the eyes watching her. But the real work, the real change, came from within. She had spent days grappling with her guilt, But now she was beginning to understand, redemption didn't come through apologies alone. It came through action. She had to take responsibility for what she had done and learn from it. And she needed to do it for more than just herself. "I've been thinking about everything you said," Jeanette replied, her voice wavering. "But I don't know how to fix it. I don't know where to start." The guard remained silent for a moment, as if contemplating the right words. Then he said something that would change everything for her. "You don't fix it all at once. You don't expect the world to forgive you overnight. But you have to start with understanding. And understanding starts with confronting your own fears and prejudices. It starts with seeing people, really seeing them, not through the lens of your own comfort or bias." Jeanette nodded slowly. The weight of his words settled in, and something clicked inside her. She had been blind to her own biases, even though they had been with her all along. It was time to see the world differently, to look at the people around her without the veil of judgment she had been taught to wear. "I want to learn," Jeanette said, her voice firm now. "I want to make this right. But how?" The guard's expression softened, though his eyes remained serious. "Start with the people you've hurt. Talk to them. Apologize. Listen. Then go further. Learn about the history behind the assumptions you've been carrying. Educate yourself. And then use your voice to stand up for others, even when it's hard. Even when it's uncomfortable." For the first time in days, Jeanette felt a spark of determination. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that the damage she had caused couldn't be undone with a few words or gestures. But she also knew that if she was willing to take responsibility, willing to confront the discomfort and the pain, maybe she could make a difference. Maybe she could change. As the guard turned to leave, he paused at the door and glanced back at her. "The real test comes when you have the chance to change things. And it's not just about you anymore, Jeanette. It's about everyone around you. Will you make the world a little bit better, or will you allow it to stay the same?" Jeanette stood there, the weight of his words pressing down on her like never before. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt a shift. She had been given a chance to make things right, a chance to confront her own prejudices and biases. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be times when she doubted herself. But she couldn't stop now. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was the only one that led to redemption. The guard left her apartment, and once again, the silence filled the room. But this time, the silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of shame or fear. It was the silence of possibility. Jeanette knew she had to do the work. And she was ready. Her journey was just beginning.